Number 3. I'm a 22-year-old woman, and about a month ago, I was looking on Craigslist to buy a couch for my new apartment. I found something that seemed like a good deal. From the pictures, the couch looked to be in great shape. The seller wanted to be contacted by email, and his email was mexicanpoppy666@hotmail.com. I thought the email was a bit off-putting, but I still went ahead and emailed him my offer. He responded within 5 minutes, accepting the offer and asking for my address. Right away, I felt uncomfortable with him asking for it. I didn't want a stranger coming to my house, so I suggested that I come to his house to pick it up instead. But he kept insisting that he come to my place. Eventually, I stopped responding. A day later, he emailed me again, this time giving me his address. At that point, I wasn't sure if I should go, but the price seemed like a steal, almost too good to be true. According to the address, he didn't live too far, so I got in my van and drove over to his house. As soon as I got there, I noticed his house was a bit smaller and more rundown compared to the others on the block. When I rang the doorbell, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap answered the door. He gave me a huge smile and invited me in. I felt uneasy right away. He led me into his living room, and I saw the couch. Immediately, I noticed scuff marks and small tears that weren't visible in the pictures. It wasn't at all in the shape that the ad showed. I pointed this out, but he just smiled and offered to lower the price. I told him I wasn't interested, and that's when things got creepy. As I was heading out of the house, he put his hand on my shoulder and said he'd give me the couch for free if I was willing to give something to him. I was disgusted and quickly got back into my car. I didn't even look back. I just drove away as fast as I could. But it didn't end there. That same night, I was lying in bed watching TV when I thought I heard someone stomping up the steps to my porch. I muted the TV and clearly heard someone messing with my front doorknob. My heart raced as I tiptoed over to look through the peephole, but whoever it was had already gone. Then, I heard the gate to my backyard open and close. That's when I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. Soon after, I heard someone trying to mess with the back door of my apartment. I yelled that the police were on their way, and then I heard the gate open and close again. Whoever it was took off. This happened a month ago, and nothing has happened since, but I still can't sleep well at night. I'm 99% sure it was the man selling the couch. He must have followed me home. There's no way it was just a coincidence. I don't plan on using Craigslist anymore, and I'm currently looking for a new apartment. Number 2. I was looking for a car to buy for my son for his 18th birthday. I searched all the usual car websites, cars.com, eBay Motors, but everything was overpriced, as expected. Craigslist was the only place where I felt like I could actually find a deal. About a week into my search, I came across an '03 Toyota Camry. It had only 67,000 miles, no accidents, no damage, and was listed in good condition for just $3,500. It seemed like a steal for such a reliable car with low mileage. The seller lived about 10 miles from me, which was a reasonable drive, so I gave him a call to set up a time to check it out. The man on the phone sounded normal and assured me there were no issues with the car. He introduced himself as Bob. I decided to bring the $3,500 in cash with me, even though I planned on negotiating the price. I arrived at Bob's property about 15 minutes early. It was a small house with a decent-sized yard, but it was far from the nearest neighbors. The garage was open, so I walked over to see if anyone was inside, but aside from an unusual amount of car parts, it was empty. The car I was there to see was nowhere in sight. The only vehicle on the property was an old pickup truck. I double-checked the house number. It was the right address. The doorbell button was missing, so I knocked on the front door. I knocked for a good 5 minutes before deciding to call him. When I dialed the number, I could hear a cell phone ringing from inside the house. That's when I got really confused. I knew I had the right place, but if he was home, why wasn't he answering? I decided to peek through one of the windows to see if anyone was inside. It was dark, but I could make out a very old-fashioned dining room set. Then, across from that, I saw someone standing at the back door, staring outside. I figured it must have been Bob, so I knocked on the window, but he didn't move at all. There was no fence or gate, just a wide-open backyard. Since this wasn't a rural area, I simply walked around the house to the backyard, still trying to figure out why he couldn't hear me. But when I got closer, I realized something horrifying. The figure standing at the back door was a taxidermied human being. I bolted straight back to my car. As I was about to drive off, I looked up at the window I had peeked through earlier. The blinds, which had been open, were now shut, except for two slats that were bent as if someone was watching me. I floored the gas pedal all the way home. The whole situation still makes no sense. The car parts, the missing Camry, the taxidermied person. The fact that there was no car there makes me believe that whoever that man was, he wasn't planning on selling me anything. The disturbing thought that haunts me is that I might have been very close to becoming just another lifeless statue, staring out of that man's back door. Number 1. I was looking to buy an iPhone 5 about a year ago and found a guy on Craigslist who was selling his for $200. He claimed it was in mint condition and that he wanted to upgrade to the 5C. I didn't really know much about testing a phone to make sure everything worked, so I brought my little brother along. He knew way more than I did. We agreed to meet halfway at a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot, even though it was around 10 o'clock at night. When we got there, two large, intimidating guys stepped out of a black Honda Civic and walked over to us. One of them pulled out the phone and showed it to me. It didn't have a scratch on it. My brother took out my SIM card and popped it into the phone. After doing some quick testing, he told me everything seemed to work. That's when the guy suddenly asked for $250, even though he had originally listed it for $200. I lied and told him I only brought $200 with me. He seemed a bit unhappy, but I wasn't about to pay more than his original asking price. I actually did have $250 on me, but I didn't want to spend more than I needed to. I figured this was just his way of making sure I didn't try to haggle the price down. I handed over the $200, and the two guys got back in their car. We got into mine, and I spent a few minutes testing out the phone by calling my girlfriend and checking some settings. That's when my brother pointed out that the guys in the Honda Civic hadn't left yet either. I didn't think much of it at first, but as soon as I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, they did the same. My brother mentioned that they started their car right when I did, which I found odd since I was pretty sure they had originally come from the opposite direction. I continued driving home, but with every turn I made, they stayed close behind. They were practically tailgating us. My brother suggested pulling over, but I knew that wasn't a good idea. I had a gut feeling these guys were looking for trouble. I started driving more aggressively, trying to lose them, but they kept following. I was getting more and more anxious, and it got to the point where I decided to do something risky. At an intersection, just as the light turned red, I floored it and sped through before any cars could start moving. My brother yelled at me, calling me crazy, but it worked. They didn't follow us through the red light. We finally made it home after taking the long way around, and I could still feel my heart racing from the whole situation. At least I got a working phone for a good price, or so I thought. Later that night, I was messing around with the phone, setting it up before bed. Everyone else in the house was already asleep. Suddenly, I heard the sound of two car doors slamming shut outside. I looked out my window, and my heart practically stopped. The black Honda Civic was parked across the street. I could only assume those two guys were already on their way to our front door. I immediately ran to wake up my dad and quickly explained everything. He grabbed a baseball bat and crouched behind the front door. Then, we heard a loud knock. My dad yelled at them to go away, but one of the guys shouted back, saying he had a gun and would shoot the lock off if we didn't open up. My dad told me to call Joe, our neighbor who lives 2 doors down. He's a police officer. I called Joe, and he said he'd be right over and told us to stay hidden. Here's the part that still gives me chills. I suddenly heard the muffled sound of a silenced gunshot. I peeked over and saw a bullet hole in the door, just inches from where my dad's head had been. My dad backed away from the door, and we all went silent, listening. Then we heard Joe outside, shouting at them to drop their weapons. My dad ran outside to help once he saw them lower their guns, and Joe arrested the two guys. That was by far the scariest day of my life, but in the end, it was also the best I had ever felt, knowing that we made it through that nightmare safely.